It started like any other ordinary morning in Ridgefield, a peaceful suburban town where life moved slowly and neighbors always waved. Laura Whitman, a 29-year-old graphic designer who worked from home, stepped out onto her porch to water her plants. That's when she saw it, a plain, brown package resting just beside her welcome mat. There were no stamps, no delivery markings, and no sender's name. It wasn't on her tracking app either. Laura frowned and picked it up. It was surprisingly light. The surface was wrapped tightly in masking tape, with no writing, labels, or barcodes. She turned it over a few times, looking for some clue, but found nothing. Her first thought was that it might be a neighbor's misdelivery or maybe some promotional drop-off. But her name wasn't on it, nor was anyone else's. She shrugged and brought it inside, setting it on the kitchen table. Curiosity tugged at her as she carefully peeled back the tape and opened the box. Inside was a smaller, dark wooden box, old, scratched, and sealed with a tiny metal clasp. Alongside it was a folded piece of white paper. Laura unfolded the paper expecting a note or a clue. It was blank. No ink. No message. Just clean white paper that felt strangely cold to the touch. She placed the wooden box on her bookshelf next to her photo frames and forgot about it for most of the day. She didn't think much of it. It felt like an odd but harmless mistake. Maybe someone left it as a prank. Maybe a kid messing around. She didn't open the wooden box either. Something about it felt personal, intrusive even. As night fell, Laura watched a movie, had dinner, and headed to bed. The box sat quietly on the shelf, almost blending in with the rest of her things. The next day passed uneventfully. She didn't give the package much thought. She had meetings, deadlines, and errands. Nothing seemed out of place. By Saturday afternoon, she was enjoying a peaceful weekend with her cat curled up on the couch and coffee in her hand. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the trees, the power suddenly went out. The whole block seemed to go dark at once. It was quiet, unnervingly so. She waited a few moments, assuming it was a temporary outage, and when the lights flickered back on 10 minutes later, she gasped. The wooden box was no longer on the bookshelf. Instead, it now sat on her coffee table, its lid open. Her heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't touched it. No one had been inside. Her doors were locked. Her windows were shut. The box hadn't made a sound. She stood frozen, staring at it, waiting for something to make sense. But there it was, open and empty. The white paper was gone. She slowly approached, eyes darting around the room. Everything else seemed untouched. No sign of a break-in. No footprints. Just that box, sitting there like it had always belonged. Something had changed. Something had started. And Laura, though she didn't yet know it, had just taken the first step into a nightmare. The following morning, Ridgefield woke to the news of a missing teenager. Jason Myers, a 17-year-old high school senior who lived 2 houses down from Laura, hadn't returned home after walking his dog the previous night. His parents assumed he had stayed over at a friend's, but by morning the dog had come back alone, muddy, leash still attached, without any sign of Jason. The leash was later discovered near the sidewalk that passed directly in front of Laura's house. Police arrived before noon, canvassing the area, knocking on doors, asking questions. Laura watched from her window as they spoke to neighbors, their clipboards in hand, their faces tight with concern. Eventually, they made their way to her door. She answered, nervous, but cooperative. She told them she hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, though that wasn't entirely true. She didn't mention the box or how it had moved on its own. It felt too strange, too unbelievable. She convinced herself it couldn't be related. The officers seemed more focused on the path Jason usually took and whether any surveillance cameras might have picked something up. Laura mentioned her door camera, but when she checked the footage with them, the night of Jason's disappearance was missing. The file had been erased between 11 p.m. and midnight, exactly when Jason would have passed by. Laura swore she hadn't deleted anything, and the officers made a note of it, though their expressions hinted at skepticism. Later that afternoon, Laura began to notice things in her house weren't where she'd left them. A glass on the kitchen counter had moved to the sink. A drawer in her desk was slightly open. Her cat, normally calm and sleepy, now hissed at corners of the room as if watching something invisible. The sense of unease that had begun with the box now settled over her like a heavy fog. She tried to shake it off, blaming stress, nerves, or the weight of the unfolding tragedy just doors away. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak and groan of the house made her flinch. At 3:12 a.m., she awoke to the sound of the front door unlocking. She sat up in bed, heart pounding. Seconds passed in silence. Then, slowly, she crept out of her room. The door was shut, locked, undisturbed. But something wasn't right. On the hardwood floor of her hallway, leading from the door toward the living room, were wet footprints. Human. There. She followed them with growing dread. They led directly to the coffee table. The wooden box was closed again. This time, a single black thread hung from under the lid. She reached for it but stopped. Her hand shook. Instead, she backed away and locked herself in the bedroom until daylight. In the morning, she called the police again. They came, inspected the house, and found no signs of forced entry. The footprints had dried. No evidence remained. They left with polite words and weary eyes. As their cruiser pulled away, Laura felt something watching her from inside. Not someone. Something. The news of Jason Meyer's disappearance spread quickly, and Ridgefield's peaceful rhythm shifted into something tense and anxious. Flyers with his face appeared on light poles, gas station windows, and supermarket bulletin boards. The community came together, forming search parties that combed through nearby woods, drainage ditches, and abandoned buildings. But no one could find a single trace of him. As the hours turned into days, hope began to dwindle. Laura watched the events unfold from behind her curtains, feeling increasingly disconnected from the world around her. The wooden box still sat untouched on her coffee table. Every time she tried to throw it away, something stopped her. Once, she placed it outside with the garbage, only to find it back in her living room the next morning, dirt smeared across its lid. Another time, she sealed it in a plastic bag and stuffed it in the trunk of her car. Later that day, the bag was ripped open, and the box sat in her back seat, perfectly intact. It seemed wherever she put it, the box returned, quietly, mysteriously, and without explanation. She started doing her own research, trying to understand what this box might be. She typed keywords into search engines: anonymous package, wooden box, strange symbols, missing teen. Most results led nowhere, but one forum post caught her attention. It was dated 5 years ago, written by someone in a different state, who claimed to have received a similar box. They mentioned receiving a blank letter, then strange occurrences around their house, followed by the sudden disappearance of their sibling. The final line of the post read, "Whatever you do, don't open it." The account was inactive. No replies. No follow-ups. Just a digital dead end. Laura brought the wooden box to the police, hoping they'd take it seriously this time. They examined it briefly, uninterested. To them, it was just a decorative item with no connection to Jason's case. One detective even joked it looked like something from a yard sale. But Laura insisted it was more than that. She flipped it over and pointed out the tiny, almost invisible carvings on the bottom. The room fell silent. Another detective leaned in, took a photo, and later confirmed that the symbols matched those associated with a defunct cult known as the Hollow Gate. The Hollow Gate had operated in the early 2000s, infamous for its cryptic beliefs, strange rituals, and a string of unsolved disappearances. It had supposedly dissolved after multiple members were arrested, but not all were ever identified. Laura's discovery reignited old fears among law enforcement. If the box was real, if the symbols were authentic, then this wasn't just a local mystery, it was something darker. Days later, Laura began receiving letters again. No return address, just a single word in bold black ink. The first read, "Remember." 2 days later, another, "You." A week after that, the final one arrived, "OWE." She didn't understand what it meant, but the message felt targeted, personal, like a warning or a debt waiting to be paid. The deeper the investigation went, the more tangled Laura's life became. Detectives began pulling her records, searching for any links between her and the now reignited Hollow Gate cult theory. At first, there was nothing unusual. She had no criminal record, lived a quiet life, paid her taxes, and rarely traveled. But when a state investigator dug into sealed juvenile files, everything changed. Hidden beneath layers of outdated documentation and legal red tape was a history Laura had never spoken of, not to her friends, not to her employer, and certainly not to the police. At 15 years old, Laura had lived under a different name in a foster care facility 2 towns over. That facility had burned down in a mysterious fire that killed 3 teenagers. At the time, it was labeled an accident caused by faulty wiring. But deeper into the files, investigators found references to a ritual room in the basement, where symbols had been drawn on the walls in ash and blood. Those same symbols now matched the ones carved beneath the wooden box. Laura had been among the survivors. No charges were filed. She was relocated, her name changed, and her records sealed by court order. For a while, she had truly disappeared from her own past. When the investigators confronted her, Laura said nothing. She denied involvement, claimed not to remember. But her silence only raised more suspicion. The theory forming was chilling. The Hollow Gate cult hadn't disbanded. It had gone underground. And Laura, knowingly or not, might have been part of it. Meanwhile, her home began to feel like a trap. Lights flickered at night, radios turned on by themselves, and whispers echoed through the hallways when no one was there. Her cat vanished one afternoon. The front door was left open, and tiny paw prints led out into the street, but never returned. Then came the boxes. Not just 1, but 5, left on porches throughout the neighborhood. Each was identical to Laura's. When opened, they were empty. Within 24 hours, 2 of those houses had been abandoned. One resident checked himself into a psychiatric clinic, claiming that shadow figures were standing at his bed every night. The other family left without packing a single item, their home still full of furniture and food. Laura could feel something tightening around her. The message was clear. The nightmare wasn't over. The words, "Remember. You. OWE," repeated in her mind like a curse. She began having dreams, or what she believed were memories. A dark room, a circle of candles, children chanting in whispers, and the smell of burning wood. In the center of the room was the box. She started to question everything: who she was, what she'd forgotten, and whether the past she'd buried was ever really gone. The wooden box remained on her table, always in the same place, always waiting. As the police pulled away from the case, overwhelmed and unsure, Laura knew the truth would not come from them. It would come from what waited inside her home, and what waited within herself. The days grew quieter in Ridgefield, but the silence was uneasy, like the town was holding its breath. People no longer lingered outside or greeted each other with smiles. Curtains stayed drawn. Doors were locked earlier. The tension that once only belonged to Laura's house had spread, reaching every corner of the neighborhood. And then, without warning, Laura disappeared. There was no sign of a struggle. No broken glass. No forced entry. Her car sat in the driveway, keys still inside. Her phone was found on the kitchen counter, still recording video. The last 11 seconds were the only part that mattered. It showed Laura standing in the center of her living room, face pale, eyes distant. She looked directly into the lens, whispered something too faint to understand, then turned and walked slowly toward the basement door. The recording ended there. When authorities reviewed the footage and investigated the house, the basement revealed nothing out of place. No alternate exits. No secret doors. Just concrete walls, old shelves, and the faint smell of earth. Laura was gone. The wooden box, too, had vanished. News of her disappearance hit the local papers, but the story died quickly. Without leads or evidence, authorities labeled it a missing person case, quietly shelving it along with Jason Meyer's unresolved file. No new packages were reported in the weeks that followed. No more letters arrived. Ridgefield slowly resumed its routine, though it was never truly the same. An invisible scar had been left behind. A month after Laura's disappearance, a package arrived at the Ridgefield Police Department. No postage. No fingerprints. Just a single plain box left in the station's overnight drop box. Inside were 3 items: a silver bracelet identified as Laura's, a photo, burned around the edges, of the 3 teens who died in the group home fire, and a folded note that read only 2 words: "Balance kept." The investigators who had previously pursued the Hollow Gate theory reopened their files, desperate to find a pattern. But everything led in circles. The few remaining former cult members they could track down were either deceased or incoherent. Some claimed to be victims. Others swore they had no memory of any involvement. None could explain the boxes, the disappearances, or the growing list of seemingly random victims who all had one thing in common: they were survivors of events they'd long tried to forget. In the years that followed, scattered reports surfaced across different states. Always the same signs: a wooden box, a blank letter, then silence, then a disappearance. None of the packages were ever traced. None of the missing were ever found. Ridgefield carried on, pretending the nightmare had passed, but some residents still swore they saw Laura from time to time, standing in a window, walking past the woods at night, her eyes black and unblinking. But when they looked again, she was gone. The truth, whatever it was, had slipped away with her. All that remained was a chilling certainty: the debt she owed had been collected, and the box had simply moved on to its next name.